The cattle were dying. Josephine Aldridge knew it the moment she crouched beside the third steer that morning and pressed 2 fingers against the animal's swollen jaw. The beast trembled beneath her touch, its eyes glassy and distant, its breathing shallow and ragged. Around her, the pasture that had been lush and green just 4 days ago now seemed to press in with a terrible, suffocating weight. 17 head were down. 5 more were staggering. And standing at the fence line, surrounded by every rancher within 40 miles of Beaumont Creek, Texas, was Levi Hale, the man who had called in every veterinarian, every experienced cattleman, and every old-timer he could find, and not a single one of them had an answer. "It's the water," declared old Crawford Finch from beneath his enormous hat, spitting tobacco juice into the dry summer dirt. "Bad water always takes them the same way." "I already tested the creek," said another man, arms crossed, studying the cattle from a safe distance. "Water's clean as it ever was." "Fever tick, then," said someone else. "Seen it kill a whole herd in 3 days." Levi Hale stood apart from all of them. At 32 years old, he was built like the Texas landscape itself, broad-shouldered and hard-edged, weathered in the way only a man who had spent every waking hour of his life outdoors could be. His jaw was set in a tight line. His dark eyes moved constantly across the field, cataloging, calculating, measuring the distance between each downed animal. He had inherited the Hale Ranch from his father 6 years ago under the worst possible circumstances, had clawed it back from the brink of bankruptcy with his bare hands, and now, when he had finally rebuilt it into something his father might have been proud of, 600 head of longhorn cattle were circling the edge of catastrophe. He had not slept in 2 days. "You all need to clear out from this field," said a voice. It was quiet. Not loud, not commanding, not even particularly urgent in its tone, but something in the certainty of it made every man present turn around. Josephine Aldridge stood at the gate. She was 26 years old, slim and sun-browned, with her dark hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years. She was wearing practical work clothes, a canvas skirt, sturdy boots, a cotton work shirt with the sleeves already rolled to the elbows. In one hand she carried a worn leather satchel. In the other she had a glass jar with a sample of something greenish-brown that she had clearly collected from somewhere on the property. Most of the men present knew her only as the woman who ran the small Aldridge operation 2 miles north, 20 acres, a modest house, maybe 60 head of cattle, the late Henry Aldridge's daughter who had stayed on after her father's death and refused every reasonable offer to sell. She barely came into town. She never attended the Cattlemen's Association meetings. She was, as Crawford Finch had once put it with supreme indifference, quiet as a fence post and about as interesting. So when she stepped through the gate and walked straight to the center of that field without hesitation, most of the men exchanged glances. Levi Hale watched her. He said nothing. "What do you think you're doing?" Crawford demanded. "This is Hale land. You got no business here." Josephine did not answer Crawford. She was already crouching beside the nearest downed steer, studying the animal with the same focused, clinical precision she had used on her own cattle for the past 10 years. She pressed carefully along the animal's neck, examined the gums, lifted one eyelid, and then tilted her head with the small, precise movement of someone who has just confirmed a theory. "Mr. Hale," she said, looking up, her dark eyes finding his across the field. "When did you move this herd into this particular pasture?" Levi blinked. Of all the questions that had been thrown at him in the past 48 hours, this was the first one that cut straight to the relevant detail. 4 days ago," he said. His voice was low and rough from exhaustion. "Why? Because your problem isn't the water," she said, standing and opening her satchel. "And it isn't tick fever, it's senesiosis." She held up the glass jar, turning it so the greenish-brown plant matter inside caught the afternoon light. "This pasture is full of tansy ragwort. It came in last winter, probably on the south end where the creek floods. It's been growing under the grass all spring. The cattle have been eating it without you knowing, and it's been destroying their livers from the inside. It's cumulative, which is why it took 4 days to show." The field went very quiet. Then Crawford Finch made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a dismissal. Woman thinks she knows more about cattle ranching than men who have been at it 30 years. Do any of you know what synesiosis is? Josephine asked. She did not say it with heat or challenge. She said it with genuine, steady curiosity, the way someone asks a question when they already know the answer. None of them said anything. Then, with respect, Mr. Finch, she said, and her eyes returned to Levi Hale's. None of you have 30 years of experience with this particular problem. I do. Levi Hale stared at her. Something shifted behind his eyes, not skepticism exactly, but the complicated recalibration of a man who has just realized that the person standing in front of him knows something critical that he does not. What do we do? He said. And the story of how they arrived at that moment, of the betrayal and the hidden motives and the dark past, and the extraordinary, terrifying, beautiful thing that quietly bloomed between them, all of it had begun 9 weeks earlier. On the morning Josephine Aldridge first saw Levi Hale's shadow fall across her doorstep. It had been a Saturday in late April of 1883, warm but not yet hot, with the scrub grass just beginning to green up along Beaumont Creek. Josephine had been out before sunrise, checking her own small herd with the meticulous daily routine she had developed over years, moving fence lines, examining hooves, recording observations in the small leather notebook she kept in her breast pocket. She tracked her cattle with a thoroughness that most ranchers in the territory would have considered excessive, noting feed consumption, water intake, behavioral changes, the consistency and quality of grazing. She had read everything she could find, the agricultural bulletins from the land-grant colleges, the veterinary texts she had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, the back issues of farming journals she had collected since she was a girl at her father's knee. Henry Aldridge had been a good rancher, a careful man, but it was Josephine who had transformed the small family operation into something precise and scientific. She had crossbred her stock deliberately, improved her pasture rotation, developed a vaccination protocol that had kept her herd free of disease for 3 years running. She had done it quietly, methodically, without boasting, which was why nobody in Beaumont Creek had the faintest idea that the quiet woman on the North Road knew more about bovine disease management than any man in the county. She was mending a section of fence on the eastern edge of her property when she heard hoofbeats coming down the road, and then the hoofbeats slowed, and then they stopped entirely. She kept working. She finished the wire splice she was in the middle of, tested the tension, and only then turned around. Levi Hale was sitting on a big gray horse at the edge of her property line, looking at her. He had the kind of face that took a moment to read all strong angles and careful control, the expression of a man who had made a long habit of keeping his interior life interior. He was wearing a weathered hat and a sun-faded shirt, and there was honest work dirt on his hands and forearms that told her he had already been out in his own fields that morning. "Miss Aldridge," he said. "That's right," she said. "I'm Levi Hale. I know who you are," she said. She did not mean it coldly. She simply was not a woman who wasted words on social pleasantries when a direct statement would serve. "Your operation is 2 miles south. About 600 head, last I heard. You added another pasture last fall, the one that runs along the old Drummond Creek bed." He studied her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. "You pay attention," he said finally. "It's my neighbor's land," she said simply. "I pay attention to everything in this valley." He swung down from the horse in a single fluid motion, looping the reins over the post at the edge of her fence line. He was taller than she had expected. She had seen him from a distance at the feed store once or twice, and his presence had a kind of quiet physical authority that she suspected he was not even aware of. He moved the way men move when they are fully accustomed to physical competence in everything they undertake. "I came to speak with you about water rights," he said, walking toward the fence line but stopping respectfully at the property edge. "The county surveyor came out last week. There's a question about the northern tributary, where it crosses your land before it reaches mine. My solicitor says the 1874 original deed gives me right-of-way access, but the county records have a discrepancy. I don't want a dispute. I'd rather talk to you directly. Josephine considered him. This was not what she had expected. Most men in the valley, when they wanted something from her, from the small operation that everyone quietly assumed was held together by stubbornness, rather than skill led with pressure rather than civility. The fact that he had come himself in person on a Saturday morning and had said plainly that he did not want a dispute told her something about his character. "Come up to the house," she said. "I have the original deed documents." He followed her up the short path to the modest farmhouse, whitewashed siding, a deep porch, a kitchen garden running along the south side with a purposeful neatness that spoke of careful management. Inside, the house was scrupulously clean and surprisingly well supplied with books. He noticed that immediately the shelves along one wall were dense with volumes, and not the usual frontier assortment of Bible and almanac. He could see agricultural texts, chemistry references, something that looked like a medical manual. She pulled the deed documents from a flat tin box she kept in the kitchen cabinet and laid them on the table. She did not sit down, and neither did he. They both leaned over the documents, and she pointed out the specific surveyor's notation from the original land grant that addressed the tributary. "You see this notation here," she said, her finger moving along the handwritten survey language. "That's the 1871 territorial survey, not the 1874 deed your solicitor is looking at. The 1871 survey supersedes the deed on water questions under Section 4 of the Texas Land Grant Framework. You have right-of-way access, but so does my property. It's a shared easement, not exclusive to either of us." Levi stared at the documents. Then he looked at her. There was something working behind his eyes, not suspicion, but reassessment. "How do you know that?" he said, and there was no condescension in it. It was a genuine question. "Because I spent 6 months after my father died making absolutely certain I understood every legal instrument attached to this land," she said. "I couldn't afford an attorney, so I taught myself what I needed to know." He straightened up slowly, something settling in his expression. "Then we don't have a dispute," he said. "We never did," she agreed. "We just have a question that hadn't been answered." He picked up his hat from where he had set it on the corner of the table, a gesture of unconscious courtesy, she noticed, removing his hat indoors without being asked. He turned it in his hands for a moment. "You run this place alone," he said. "I have a hand, Bert, who comes 3 days a week," she said. "Otherwise, yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any weight of charity or condescension in it, simply as a statement of fact, "That's a hard thing." "It is," she agreed, equally simply. "I'm good at it." A corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "I believe you," he said, which was not something she had expected him to say. He was back on his horse and down the road in another 5 minutes, and Josephine watched him go from the porch with an expression she kept carefully neutral. Because the thing that had happened inside the kitchen, the thing she was not yet willing to examine directly, was the unfamiliar sensation of being taken seriously by a man she had just met, and it had done something unexpected to her pulse. She went back to her fence mending and put it out of her mind. Or she tried to. The next time she saw Levi Hale was 3 weeks later, at the Beaumont Creek General Store. She was loading sacks of salt blocks onto her wagon when he came out of the store with a roll of wire under one arm and 2 men from his ranch crew behind him, deep in conversation about a shipping contract. He saw her across the street and did something that none of the other men in Beaumont Creek had ever done when they saw her struggling with a heavy load. He crossed the street, without fanfare, without even finishing his sentence, and lifted the heaviest sack from the wagon bed with a straightforward ease that made her realize just how much of her physical effort she normally expended on tasks his body accomplished without strain. "Thank you," she said. "Neighborly," he said, and went back to his conversation. She sat in the wagon seat for a moment after he had gone back inside, aware of something she recognized as a trap. Specifically, the trap of reading meaning into small courtesies from a man who was probably simply courteous, nothing more. She had been through that particular trap once before, 6 years ago, with a man named Thomas Garrett, who had seemed to admire her capability right up until the moment he had proposed, and she had realized his vision of their future involved her capability disappearing entirely in favor of her domesticity. She had said no, and he had left the county, and she had told herself she felt nothing about it. She slapped the reins and guided her horse home and thought about her pasture rotation schedule, which was considerably more reliable than thinking about Levi Hale. But the valley was small, and Beaumont Creek was smaller, and the spring of 1883 had a way of throwing neighbors together in ways that the wide Texas sky seemed to arrange without consultation. 2 weeks after the store encounter, a section of the tributary levee that fed both their properties began to erode dangerously after 3 days of heavy rain. The water rushed and churned and the dirt banks crumbled, and it became apparent very quickly that if the levee was not reinforced, both properties would lose significant acreage to flooding. It was Josephine who rode to Hale's ranch at 6 in the morning to tell him, because she had been up at 4 watching the water rise and had already calculated the extent of the problem. She arrived at the Hale Ranch headquarters, a handsome, functional complex of buildings, larger than she had expected, well-maintained in the purposeful way of a man who cared about the work rather than the appearance, and found Levi already outside, already looking south toward the sound of rushing water, already calculating. He turned when he heard her horse on the gravel. "I know," he said. "I have a plan," she said. He looked at her for just a moment, the look, she was beginning to understand, of a man genuinely interested in what someone else has to say, and said, "Let me hear it," she told him. She had a detailed knowledge of the water table and the levee structure from years of careful observation, and she had worked out overnight that the fastest reinforcement method using available materials would involve a combination of cut cedar posts, burlap sandbag supports, and a strategic upstream diversion that would reduce the pressure on the weakest section of the bank. She described it quickly and precisely, and he listened without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "You've got the cedar." "Not enough," she said. "I have posts for about 40 feet. I need another 60. "I have the 60, he said, and turned back toward his barn. "Give me 10 minutes. They worked alongside each other for 8 hours that day, with his 4 ranch hands assisting, building the reinforcement along the levee while the brown water surged and churned below them. Josephine worked with her sleeves rolled up and her hat pulled low, directing the placement of the sandbag supports with the confident precision of someone who has thought the problem through completely. Levi worked beside her with enormous physical output, hauling posts, driving stakes, moving earth with his hands and a spade, and he watched her. Not in the way men sometimes watched women, appraisingly or dismissively, but with the specific attention of a man observing a skilled colleague and learning from what he sees. At one point in the mid-afternoon, she was directing 2 of his hands on the upstream diversion section when she heard a shout and turned to see that one of the temporary supports had shifted, and a section of the bank was beginning to slide toward the water. She was closer than anyone else. Without hesitation, she dropped into the levee below the slide, grabbed the slipping support post with both hands, braced her feet against the cut cedar base, and held it until Levi came behind her and drove the anchor stakes deep into the bank above, locking the structure in place. For approximately 3 seconds, they were standing inches apart in the bottom of a muddy levee ditch, her arms trembling from the effort, his hands still on the stakes, both of them breathing hard. He looked down at her. She looked up at him. "Good hold," he said quietly. "Good stakes," she said. They both stepped back and went back to work, and neither of them mentioned it again, but something in the texture of the day had changed in those 3 seconds, had acquired a weight and a warmth that the work itself did not account for, and Josephine was very careful on the ride home not to think about it too directly. The levee held. Both properties were saved. The total damage was minimal: some fence line lost on Josephine's east side, a section of Hale's south pasture that would need regrading, but nothing that could not be repaired. He sent word the following morning through his hand, asking her to let him know the extent of the fence loss on her side so he could send materials. She wrote back a precise, businesslike note that she pretended she did not rewrite 3 times. The weeks that followed had an odd quality, the quality, she thought on her more honest evenings, of two people who are circling something with great caution, because they have both been burned by carelessness before. He would find occasions to pass by the Aldridge property on his way somewhere nearby. She would find that she noticed the gray horse at the feed store and took slightly longer in her shopping than strictly necessary. They talked when they saw each other, sometimes about practical matters, the water table, the summer hay supply, a question about a breeding bull he was considering, which she answered with a specificity that made his eyebrows go up, and sometimes about things that were not practical at all, the books she was reading, the letter he had received from his brother in New Mexico, the way the summer storms built in the southwest before rolling across the plain. He had not had a close friendship with a woman since his mother had died when he was 19. He had worked and built and grieved and built more, and there had been women who wanted him. He was not unaware of that, was simply careful about it in the way of a man who has watched careless choices destroy other men he respected. But none of them had known things he did not know, and he had not understood until Josephine Aldridge how much that mattered to him. She had not had a close friendship with a man since her father. She had not wanted to. She had told herself she did not want one still, on the evenings when she reread passages of veterinary text to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But the memory of Levi Hale's voice in the levee ditch, good hold, with that particular quiet quality that meant exactly what it said, and nothing more and nothing less. She kept coming back to that. Then the morning of June the 14th came, and with it the illness, and with it the pasture full of tansy ragwort and dying cattle, and Josephine stood in the center of Levi Hale's pasture with a jar of plant samples and watched his face while he processed what she was telling him, and every other man in that field fell away into irrelevance. Senesiosis, he repeated, testing the word. You're certain? I'm certain, she said. She opened her satchel and produced a folded page from an agricultural bulletin, one of the Southwestern Stockman issues from 1881 that had published a comprehensive report on pyrrolizidine alkaloid toxicity in grazing cattle. Here, the specific symptom pattern, the jaw swelling, the neurological signs, the 4 to 7 day delay between ingestion and crisis, its textbook. He took the paper from her. He read it with the focused attention of a man who is reading for his life, because in a real sense he was. Then he looked up. What do we do? He said again, and this time it was not a question in the general sense. It was a question directed to her specifically as the person in that field who knew the answer. We move the herd out of this pasture immediately, she said. Every animal, regardless of how healthy they look, because by the time the symptoms show, the liver damage is already done. You'll lose some, the ones already down may be too far along. But if you move the rest now and support the ones that are symptomatic with clean water, salt supplementation, and rest, most of them have a chance. She could see him running the numbers behind his eyes, the cost of losing even a portion of his herd, the logistics of the immediate move, the question of where to hold 600 cattle while an entire pasture was cleared and treated. What about the pasture, he said. We need to pull every tansy ragwort plant in it, she said. The root system is extensive, so it has to be done carefully. You can't just mow it, because cut plants are actually more palatable to cattle and even more toxic. It has to be pulled by hand or poisoned with a copper sulfate treatment, and then the pasture needs to rest for at least 60 days. Crawford Finch made a sound of extreme disbelief. You're going to pull weeds by hand out of a 40-acre pasture, he said. That's the most, Mr. Finch, said Levi Hale, and there was something in his voice that cut clean through the older man's dismissal, a quiet authority that did not need volume to function. "I'd be grateful if you and the others would excuse us." Crawford's mouth closed. He looked at Levi with surprise and something approaching affront. Levi held his gaze with perfect steadiness, and after a moment, Crawford turned and walked toward the fence line. The other men followed, some with puzzled looks, some with the specific expression of men who have just watched something they do not entirely understand but cannot argue with. When they were gone, Levi turned back to Josephine. He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she could see him doing something she had never seen a man of his standing do, so completely setting aside his own pride and his own expertise and placing his trust in someone else's. "Tell me everything you need," he said, "and I'll get it done." They moved the herd that afternoon. All 6 of Levi's hands were deployed, along with Josephine's one-hand Bert, who arrived within the hour at her summons. The healthy cattle were driven to the northern pasture, the borderland between Hale's property and Josephine's own land, where the grass was clean and the water source was a different tributary entirely. The symptomatic cattle, 23 of them by that point, though 7 appeared to be in the later stages, were separated into a holding pen near the main barn where they could be monitored individually. Josephine went from animal to animal in the holding pen, with a systematic focus that drew Levi's eyes despite himself. She was assessing degrees of liver damage by a combination of symptom severity, responsiveness, and the specific quality of the mucous membranes around the eyes, a technique she had developed from combining veterinary text observations with her own years of practical experience. She categorized the 23 into 3 groups: those likely to recover with supportive care, those who might recover with intensive support, and those who were too far advanced to save. That last group numbered 6 animals. She told him. She did not soften it or hedge around it, because false hope in a crisis was more dangerous than the hard truth. "These 6, she said, standing in the pen with her notebook open, "are not going to recover. Their livers are too compromised. If you want to preserve what value you can, you'd need to make that decision soon." He stood beside her, very still, looking at the 6 animals. His jaw worked for a moment. The loss of 6 head of good longhorn cattle was not a financial crisis for an operation of his size, but the weight of it, the weight of animals he had been responsible for, was something else. Something she understood from her own harder years. "And the rest," he said. "Most of them, I think, yes," she said. "The 17 who were already down this morning, I want to reassess each of them this evening. Some of them were early in the progression when they went down. If we're aggressive with the supportive care, I believe we can save most of them." He looked at her. Just looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, which was the expression of someone who is simultaneously overwhelmed by gratitude and struck dumb by the sheer scope of what the person in front of them knows. "Why are you here?" he said. It was not an unkind question. It was a real one. "You didn't have to come." She held his gaze. "I watched those cattle going down when I came past your South Road this morning," she said, "and I knew what it was. I wasn't going to walk past that knowing what I know." He was quiet for another moment. Then, with the deliberate, considered quality of a man who chooses his words with care, "Miss Aldridge, thank you." There was so much in those 3 words. A specificity and a weight of genuine acknowledgement that was not about manners or courtesy, but about recognition, real recognition, of what she had done and who she was and why it mattered. Josephine, who had kept her own counsel about her emotions for many years, found that those 3 words required considerably more internal management than she would have liked. "Let's get to work," she said. The next 3 days were among the most extraordinary of Josephine's life, and she would recognize them as such only later, because while she was living them, she was too absorbed in the work to stand back and see the shape of what was happening. She established herself at the Hale Ranch for those 3 days. There was no question of her making the 4-mile round trip twice daily to monitor the symptomatic cattle. The care schedule she had devised required assessments every 4 hours, and so a cot was arranged for her in the small office attached to the main barn, and Levi Hale's housekeeper, a pragmatic woman named Mrs. Clancy, brought food without commentary and went back to her business. Levi worked alongside her. This surprised her. She had expected that once she had provided the knowledge, he would delegate the execution to his hands and return to the broader management of the ranch. Instead, he was there at every assessment, learning the observation techniques, understanding the symptom progressions, participating in the care routine with a focused, intelligent attentiveness that she found unexpectedly compelling. He asked good questions, not questions that challenged her conclusions. He had clearly decided on the basis of evidence that her conclusions were sound, but questions that sought deeper understanding, the how and why behind the what. On the second evening, they were sitting on the fence rails of the holding pen in the late light, after the 6 o'clock assessment, both of them tired in the deep physical way of people who have been working without adequate rest for 2 days. Josephine had her notebook open on her knee, writing up observations. Levi sat nearby, his forearms on the top rail, looking at the cattle in the pen. "My father would have thought I was insane," he said, "taking instruction from a woman I'd only really known 6 weeks. Josephine considered several responses to this. "What do you think?" she said. He turned his head and looked at her. The evening light was red-orange across the plain, and it caught the lines of his face in a way that made them sharp and warm simultaneously. "I think," he said slowly, "that any man who wouldn't take good advice from a knowledgeable source because that source happened to be a woman is choosing his pride over his cattle, and his pride can't be sold at market." She almost laughed. It came up from somewhere unexpected, that impulse, the surprise of finding that he had articulated the exact right principle with such understated precision. She suppressed most of it, but a small smile got through, and she saw him register it with an expression of carefully concealed pleasure. "Your father raised a practical man," she said. "He tried," he said. "Took me longer to become one than it should have." He paused, looking back at the cattle. "What made you start reading the veterinary journals, the agricultural bulletins?" "Desperation initially," she said, with a frankness that came easily by this point in the relaxed exhaustion of late evening. "When my father was sick, the summer before he died, I had to manage the herd alone. I didn't have enough experience, and I had a sick animal that none of the men in the area could diagnose properly. I wrote to the agricultural college in Austin and asked for information, and they sent me a reading list instead of thinking it was an odd request from a rancher's daughter. I just kept going from there." "What happened to the animal?" he said. "I saved her," she said. "She's still the best producer in my herd. Her name is Augusta." He smiled then, a full smile, the kind that changed the whole architecture of his face and made her look away at the cattle before she did something inadvisable with her expression. On the third morning, Josephine conducted her final assessment of the 17 originally downed cattle. The results were better than she had dared to hope. 12 of them were showing clear improvement, with restored responsiveness, improved appetite, and mucous membranes returning toward normal color. 3 remained uncertain. 2 were not going to recover, and she told Levi so without evasion. The total final count, of the 23 symptomatic cattle, she had predicted 6 losses from the original batch and 2 from the 17. With the rapid herd move and supportive care, 9 additional cattle that Crawford Finch's group had been prepared to write off were now walking, eating, and improving. Levi Hale's total loss from the senesiosis outbreak, thanks to Josephine Aldridge's intervention, was 8 head rather than the potential 60 or more that it would have been without her. He did the arithmetic standing in the barn doorway on the morning of the 3rd day, and then he looked at her across the hay-strewn barn floor with an expression that was so open and so unguarded that she had to remind herself quite firmly of the trap she had identified 7 weeks ago. The trap of reading too much into things. The trap of Thomas Garrett and his betrayal of her expectations. Because what she saw in Levi Hale's face was not the appreciation of a man for a useful resource, but the expression of a man who is looking at a person he has just realized matters to him in a way he was not prepared for. "Miss Aldridge," he said. "Josephine," she said, because if they were going to have this conversation, whatever this conversation was, she was not going to have it at a last-name distance. He blinked at that very slightly as if she had said something startling. "Josephine," he said, and then he stopped and started again. "I owe you, you don't owe me anything," she said immediately, firmly. "I did this because it needed doing, not for payment." "That's not what I was going to say," he said. He moved toward her, crossing the barn floor with the measured deliberateness of a man who is choosing his words, and his steps with equal care. He stopped at a respectful distance, close enough that she could see the exhaustion and the emotion working behind his dark eyes. "I was going to say that I owe you an apology." She was genuinely surprised. "For what?" "For knowing you were out there," he said, "doing what you do with what you know and never once asking, never once treating you as the resource you are, never once being a good enough neighbor to understand what was right next door." He paused. "I'm not a man who makes speeches. What I mean is, you came into my field 3 days ago and saved something I've spent 6 years building, and I don't know how to account for that except to tell you that I see you. I see who you are. And I'm sorry it took me 6 weeks to see it clearly." Josephine stood with that for a moment. She was aware of the quiet in the barn, the particular stillness of early morning, the sound of cattle moving in the distance and somewhere outside a meadowlark doing its liquid, cascading call. She was aware of Levi Hale standing 4 feet in front of her with his hat in his hands, and his heart on visible display in a way that a man like him, guarded, private, hard-built, almost certainly found uncomfortable. She was aware of the fact that she was no longer fighting the warmth that had been building in her chest since that morning in the levee ditch 6 weeks ago. "You're not the only one who should have paid more attention," she said, and her voice was quieter than usual. "I could have introduced myself properly when you bought the south pasture. I could have come to any of the cattlemen's meetings and made myself known. I chose to stay private. That's my own habit." "Why?" he said, with the same genuine curiosity he had brought to every other question. She met his eyes. "Because the last time I made my capabilities visible to a man who said he admired them," she said, "he wanted to lock them away in a kitchen." She paused. "I decided it was simpler not to bother." The understanding that moved across his face was quiet and complete. "I want to be clear about something," he said. He held her gaze with a steadiness that was not aggressive but absolute. "Anything I feel about the person standing in front of me is because of exactly who she is, not in spite of it, and it is not contingent on her becoming anything different." The meadowlark outside sang its complicated, falling phrase. Josephine Aldridge, who had not cried in front of another person since the day she buried her father, and who had absolutely no intention of crying in a barn in front of a man she was not even sure she could trust yet, said, "You should make sure you mean that before you say it." "I've been making sure for 6 weeks," he said. "I'm sure." She looked at him, he looked at her. The barn was very quiet. "Then ask me something real," she said. He was still for a moment. "Then, would you have dinner with me? At the hotel in town, not as a neighbor, not as a business arrangement, as something else?" "Yes," she said, and she meant it so completely that the simplicity of the word seemed almost insufficient for the weight it carried. The dinner happened 2 evenings later, on a Saturday in mid-June, and Crawford Finch saw them arrive at the Beaumont Creek Hotel dining room together and nearly choked on his coffee, which Josephine privately found deeply satisfying. They sat across a table covered in white linen, and they talked for 3 hours, not about cattle or water rights or agricultural bulletins, though those things circled comfortably at the edges, but about everything else. His mother, who had been a schoolteacher in Virginia before following her husband west. Her father, who had believed before his death that Josephine was the sharpest mind he had ever encountered, and had told her so once, without elaboration, in a way that she had carried like a provision through the hard years since. his brother in New Mexico, and the complicated history of two Hale sons who had not always agreed on the right way to grieve a lost father. Her decision to stay on the ranch when everyone in the county had quietly expected her to sell and go back east to whatever a woman did when she didn't have a husband. "I never seriously considered it," she said. "The land is mine. My father built it. I know every inch of it." "You love it," he said. "Yes," she said again simply because it was exactly true. "So do I," he said. "My land." I didn't always understand why. When I was younger, I thought it was obligation, what you do because it's what you inherited. But somewhere in the last few years, it stopped being obligation and became something else. It's the only place I've ever felt entirely at home. She understood that so precisely and so completely that she felt the understanding in her chest. "Yes," she said for the third time. "Exactly." They walked back up the main street of Beaumont Creek in the warm summer dark, past the hardware store and the livery, and the saloon with its noise and lamplight spilling onto the dirt street. And Levi Hale offered her his arm with a formality that felt somehow both old-fashioned and entirely right. And Josephine took it with a naturalness that surprised her, because she had never been a woman who reached for things easily. He brought her back to her wagon at the edge of town and helped her up to the seat, and stood at the wheel for a moment looking up at her with the town lamps behind him and the wide Texas sky above both of them and the summer night full of crickets and the distant low sound of the creek. "When can I see you again?" he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I'm 2 miles north. Tomorrow." He said, and the slight roughness in his voice told her what it cost him to ask this directly, this man who had built such careful walls around his interior life. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She drove home in the warm dark, and the meadowlark was silent at this hour, but the creek spoke in its steady voice all the way along the north road, and Josephine Aldridge allowed herself, for the first time in a very long time, to feel something she had almost convinced herself she did not want, the genuine, uncomplicated, terrifying joy of the beginning of something real. The summer moved forward. The Hale pasture was cleared of tansy ragwort, a massive undertaking that involved not just Levi's hands but a temporary labor crew from town, and which Josephine supervised with the methodical expertise that was now, among everyone who had been at the property during the crisis, no longer in question. Crawford Finch was conspicuously absent from any of the clearing work, but word traveled in a small valley the way water finds a downhill path, and by July the story of what had happened, the quiet woman from the North Road who had walked into a dying pasture and known exactly what was killing the cattle and exactly how to save them, had made its circuit through Beaumont Creek several times over. What changed was not loud or dramatic. The men at the general store began to ask Josephine's opinion when she was in town. The county livestock agent stopped by her property one afternoon with a question about a disease case in the western part of the county, and spent 2 hours at her kitchen table taking notes. The Beaumont Creek Cattlemen's Association, which had never had a woman member, sent an uncomfortable, carefully worded letter in August asking whether she might be willing to speak at their September meeting about the tansy ragwort situation and its management. She wrote back a comfortable, direct, uncomplicated reply saying that she would be glad to. Levi was at the September meeting. He sat in the third row of the hard wooden chairs arranged in the Masonic Hall, and he listened to Josephine stand at the front of the room and speak with calm authority to 40 men who had underestimated her for years, and he felt a particular pride in her that he recognized was not possessive, was not the pride of ownership or association, but the specific pride of someone who has recognized a person's true quality and gets to watch the world catch up. After the meeting, as the men filed out, many of them stopping to speak with her to ask questions, to express the particular awkward respect of men who have been forced by circumstance to revise a long-held dismissal, he waited near the door until the room was mostly empty. "You were excellent," he said when she made her way to him. "I was factual," she said, which was her version of modest. That too, he agreed. He was smiling, that full smile that she had catalogued carefully and still found unexpectedly disarming. Can I take you home? I have my own horse, she said. I know, he said. I mean, can I ride alongside you? She looked at him for a moment, and then the corner of her mouth curved and she said, yes. They rode the North Road home in the September dusk, side by side at the easy pace of people who are comfortable in shared silence. At the gate to her property she reined in her horse, and he stopped the gray beside her, and they sat for a moment in the last light, looking at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to define themselves. I need to tell you something, Levi said. All right, she said. He turned the gray slightly, enough to face her more directly. He was very still in the way that she had learned meant he was about to say something that cost him something to say. I have been thinking, he said, about the nature of what is happening between us and about what I want, and I don't want to be unclear. I am not a man who does things halfway. I don't know how to court a woman partway or admire her partway or want a future with her partway. He paused. I am asking you if there is a future here, a real one, because I'm not interested in any lesser version of this. Josephine sat with that in the early starlight, her hands easy on the reins, the horses breathing their steady warm breath in the cooling evening air. She thought about the trap she had identified in April, and she tested it. She pressed against the thing she had called a trap, the fear of misreading, the old lesson of Thomas Garrett, and she found that it no longer held. What Levi Hale had shown her over 5 months was not a performance of admiration that would later resolve into something else. It was the consistent, daily, evidenced reality of a man who saw her as she was and wanted her as she was, without caveat or condition. I've been thinking about the same thing, she said, for longer than I intended to. And, he said, yes, she said, a real one. He exhaled a long, controlled breath that told her how much tension he had been holding in his chest, and then he leaned across the small distance between their horses and very gently, very deliberately, very carefully, he kissed her. It was brief and proper, and in the open air on the public road, and it was simultaneously the most serious thing that had happened to her in years. When he pulled back, his eyes were searching hers with a warm uncertainty she found unexpectedly dear. Good, she said quietly. Good, he agreed, and the smile that followed was the best version of the smile she had catalogued, the open, unguarded, entirely undefended version that he showed only when he had forgotten to be careful, and she kept it inside her chest on the ride to the barn with the care she would have given something precious and irreplaceable. The autumn of 1883 in Beaumont Creek passed the way the best autumns pass with color and harvest, and the particular satisfaction of work completed well, against the backdrop of something building quietly and steadily between two people who are, for once in their lives, exactly where they are supposed to be. They saw each other nearly every day. There was always a practical reason: the shared easement, the pasture clearance monitoring, the collaborative work on a new fence line along their shared boundary. But the practical reasons became thinner and thinner as pretexts until one morning in October, Josephine stopped pretending she needed a reason and simply rode south, and Levi met her at the gate and said, I was hoping, and she said, so was I, and that was sufficient. They developed habits. Sunday mornings, she rode to Hale Ranch, and they had breakfast at the big table in the kitchen with Mrs. Clancy, who was approximately 300 years old and had strong opinions about everything, and had apparently decided that Josephine was one of the best developments in recent memory. Wednesday evenings, Levi rode north and they sat on her porch in the cooling dark and read separately, in companionable proximity, and talked when they wanted to and were quiet when they preferred that. He asked her once, on a Wednesday evening in November when the air had gone sharp with coming winter, what she thought about the future of the ranch, the Aldridge Ranch specifically, what her plans were, where she expected to be in 10 years. She considered this carefully as she considered everything carefully. I want to expand the herd, she said. Selectively, I've been developing a crossbreeding approach for the last 3 years that I think will significantly improve heat tolerance and disease resistance. I want to keep the property, obviously. I want to continue the research. She paused. What are you actually asking? He set his book down on his knee. I'm asking whether your future, in any version of your planning, has room for someone in it. Specifically me. She closed her own book. Levi, she said, in the tone of someone who is about to be very direct about something the other person should have known. You have been in my planning since approximately June. He blinked. Then the undefended smile appeared, larger this time, threatening to become a laugh. Since June, he repeated. That's the month I asked you to dinner. Yes, she said placidly. I'm efficient. He did laugh then, a warm, full sound in the cold November air, and she felt it as physical warmth, the sound of his happiness at something she had said, and she thought that if she were to make a catalog of the things she had not expected to find in her life, this laughing man on her porch in the November dark would be near the top of it. Josephine, he said, when the laughter had settled. He was looking at her with the serious warmth that was, she had determined, his most characteristic expression. I want to marry you. I want to ask you properly with all the formality that deserves when the moment is right, but I wanted you to know that it's where I'm headed so you can tell me if I'm going in the wrong direction. You're going in the right direction, she said. But yes, when you ask properly. Understood, he said gravely and picked his book back up. She sat beside him in the dark with her own book open but unread, and felt the specific, extraordinary quiet of a life settling into the shape it was always supposed to have. He asked properly in December, on a Sunday morning after breakfast, with Mrs. Clancy conspicuously absent from the kitchen, and a ring that had been his mother's. A simple, beautiful thing, silver set with a small turquoise stone, the frontier making its own version of the old traditions, held in a hand that was visibly, slightly, unsteadily nervous. He said, Josephine Aldridge, I have never in my life met anyone I admired more, trusted more, or wanted to be beside more. You are the most capable, most honest, most remarkable person I know. Will you marry me? She looked at the ring, and she looked at him, and she felt the weight of the question against the weight of everything that had brought them both to this kitchen on this winter morning. The levee and the tansy ragwort and the long evenings on the porch, and the moment in the barn when he had said I see you with a completeness that no one else had ever matched, and she said, yes, with my whole heart, yes. He put the ring on her finger with hands that steadied as soon as she took hold of them, and then he stood, and she stood, and he held her with his face against her hair, in the kitchen warmth with the winter pressing at the windows, and neither of them spoke for a long moment because the silence had everything necessary already inside it. They were married in February of 1884, in the Beaumont Creek Methodist Church, in a ceremony that was simple and direct, which suited both of them with Mrs. Clancy weeping abundantly in the second pew, and Levi's brother Daniel having arrived from New Mexico for the occasion, a broad-shouldered man who had Levi's eyes and a quick grin that told Josephine immediately where the more expressive version of the family temperament had gone. Josephine's neighbor Bert stood as a witness, looking deeply moved and somewhat baffled by the formality of his own emotions. Crawford Finch was in attendance. This surprised Josephine until she saw his face, not defiance or discomfort, but the expression of a man who has, slowly and against his will, and only through the pressure of accumulated evidence, revised a long-held position. He shook her hand after the ceremony and said, Miss Aldridge, Mrs. Hale, I suppose. He paused. I've been a fool. Yes, she said, because she was Josephine Aldridge and honesty was a condition of her character. But you're here, so that counts for something. He blinked, and then something in his old, weathered face shifted toward something almost like admiration. Hell of a woman, he said to no one in particular, and wandered toward the reception table. He said that like it just occurred to him, Levi murmured beside her. For him it did, she said. We'll take the victories we can get. He took her hand, which was still slightly foreign and entirely wonderful, and the afternoon light came through the church windows and lay warm and golden across the gathered people, and the white tablecloths, and the modest wedding cake Mrs. Clancy had constructed with fierce personal investment. And it was the most beautiful thing Josephine had ever seen. The merged Hale Aldridge operation, because that is what it became, practically speaking, an enterprise that drew on both properties and both sets of expertise, developed over the following years into something that quietly became the most admired cattle operation in the county. Levi's management of the physical infrastructure, his relationships with the buyers and the railroad representatives who had extended the rail line to within 20 miles of Beaumont Creek, his ability to negotiate from a position of integrity, these were considerable. Josephine's crossbreeding program produced, over 3 years of selective work, a strain of longhorn Hereford cross that was demonstrably more resistant to the Texas heat and more disease-tolerant than the standard longhorn stock. She documented it carefully and shared the findings with the Agricultural College in Austin, which published her work in their 1886 bulletin under her full name, which was the first time a woman's name had appeared in that publication. The letter from Austin arrived on a Thursday morning in October of 1886, and she read it at the kitchen table, the kitchen of Hale Ranch, which had been her kitchen for 2 years by then, which she had made her own in the specific ways a woman makes a space hers without erasing what was good in it before, and Levi came in from the morning rounds and found her sitting very still with the letter in her hands. "What happened?" he said, coming to her immediately. She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it, watched his eyes move through the formal academic language of the publication notice, watched him reach the part where it said the crossbreeding methodology documented by Mrs. Josephine Hale represents a significant contribution to the understanding of bovine heat adaptation in the southwestern territories. He looked up. His face was doing several things at once. "Josephine," he said. "I know," she said quietly. He sat down beside her and took both her hands in his, the letter still folded between their fingers, and said, "Your father would have," he stopped, because he had not known Henry Aldridge, had only heard of him through her, and he was not going to presume. He started again. "You deserve every word of this, every word." She looked at him, and for once, for just this once, she did not school her expression into its habitual calm, and let him see the full extent of what this meant to her. He held it with the careful steadiness of a man who has learned that some moments require not response, but simple witness. "Thank you," she said, exactly as he had said it to her that morning in the barn, 2 years ago, with all its specific weight. He brought her hands to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, and kept holding them, and they sat together at the kitchen table with the October sun coming through the window, and the certificate of academic recognition lay between them on the table, and outside the cattle moved in the clean-grazed pastures where tansy ragwort had not grown since 1883. Their son was born in the spring of 1887, which was one of the great surprises of Josephine's life. Not that she was surprised by the fact of a baby, since that was a logical consequence of marriage and she had always been logical, but by the particular, specific, extraordinary violence of the love that arrived with him, the way it hit her like a physical force, the first time she held the small, squalling, red-faced person who was entirely real and entirely hers. They named him Henry for her father. He had Levi's dark eyes and what appeared in early exhibition to be Josephine's disposition, watchful, precise, and more interested in observing than announcing himself. Levi, who had never believed he had any capacity for softness, spent the first week of his son's life in a state of barely contained wonder that he made absolutely no attempt to conceal. He held Henry with the careful confidence of a man who trusts his own hands, and talked to him in a low, steady voice about the cattle and the land and the creek, and Josephine watched from the doorway of the bedroom and felt something she could not entirely describe, the sense of a story arriving at its most important chapter and being entirely, overwhelmingly glad to be inside it. Henry learned to walk in the Hale Ranch kitchen, in the path between the table and Mrs. Clancy's feet, with the wide Texas sky visible through the south windows. He learned to ride at 4, on a patient older mare that Josephine had selected and Levi had trained specifically for the purpose. He learned to read early, because his mother had books everywhere and read to him every night with the focused, purposeful love of a woman who has always believed that what you put into a mind in its earliest years is the most important agricultural work there is. By the time Henry was 3, Josephine was expecting again, and the spring of 1890 brought them a daughter, whom they named Clara, for Levi's mother, whose real name had been Clara Virginia Hale, and who had died too young and left behind a son who had kept her memory in a closed place in his chest for 13 years, until Josephine had gently, without pressure, opened enough space in their life together for the grief to have somewhere to go. Clara had Josephine's coloring and her father's easy confidence, and a personality that announced itself with absolute clarity from approximately the 3rd day of her life. She was going to be someone who made herself known, which was already, by her parents' private assessment, a marked contrast to her older brother's careful quietude. "She's going to be interesting," Levi said, on the second morning, holding Clara with Henry peering with solemn scientific interest over his forearm. "She is already interesting," Josephine said from the bed, tired and peaceful and luminous in the way new mothers are when they are also deeply satisfied. "She's loud," Henry said, with the considered gravity of a 3-year-old rendering judgment. "Yes," agreed his father. "She is also in some ways like your mother." Josephine looked at him with an eyebrow raised because she was Josephine Aldridge, Josephine Hale, and she was not going to let that pass without interrogation. "Explain that." "She already knows what she wants," he said simply, "and she's not pretending otherwise." Josephine considered this. "That's the nicest thing you've said about me in some time," she said. "I said it 6 days ago," he said, "before Clara arrived." "6 days feels like months in present circumstances," she said. He moved around to the side of the bed, Henry trotting alongside, and sat carefully on the edge. And the 4 of them were together in the morning light with the creek speaking outside the window and the cattle in the distant fields. And it was so entirely, unreservedly good that Josephine, who was not a woman given to sentiment as a general rule, let it be good without qualification or caveat or the old protective habits of distance that she had long since stopped needing. The years that followed were the years of full life, not the absence of hardship, because the Texas frontier in the late 1880s and early 1890s continued to offer hardship with its customary generosity, drought years and market fluctuations, and the occasional crisis that required the full deployment of everything both of them knew and had built, but hardship inside the frame of a partnership so solid and mutually sustaining that it changed the nature of the difficulty entirely. During the drought of 1890, when water levels dropped to frightening lows across the county, Josephine's knowledge of the water table and her careful management of the shared tributary easement allowed both properties to survive losses that devastated some of their neighbors. She designed a rotating water access schedule and shared it with the entire valley, including the families who had never spoken much to her and the men who had dismissed her for years, because the knowledge was useful and withholding useful knowledge from people in a drought was not something she was willing to do. Crawford Finch came to her door in August of that terrible dry summer and asked for help with his cattle, which were suffering from a nutrition deficiency problem that she recognized and he could not diagnose. She helped him without condescension and without the satisfaction of "told you so," because those were not things she had ever had room for, and he left her doorstep with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has learned something important and late and is grateful and humiliated in equal measure. "You didn't have to do that," Levi said that evening. "He needed help," she said. "He spent years dismissing you," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you spent years not knowing I was there, and now look at us." She looked at him sidelong with the small, dry warmth that was her version of teasing. "People can surprise you if you give them the chance." He looked at her for a moment with that expression, the open, undefended one, and then he said, "You're a better person than most." "I'm a practical person," she corrected. "Grudges are expensive and I don't have budget for them." He laughed, and she felt it, as always, like physical warmth. The Hale Ranch grew. Not extravagantly, not with the driven hunger of men who measure their worth in acreage, but steadily and soundly, with the organic growth of something well managed and well understood. Josephine's crossbreeding program continued to develop, and by 1892, the Hale strain of cattle was recognized throughout the region as demonstrably superior stock. She began to consult formally, not just informally across the fence line, but with ranchers from neighboring counties who came specifically to speak with her, who made the trip to Beaumont Creek knowing that the person they needed to talk to was Mrs. Josephine Hale. Levi watched this with the specific pride she had seen in him first at the cattlemen's meeting in September of 1883, and which had never lessened. He managed the business negotiations, the shipping contracts, the complex relationships with buyers in Fort Worth and San Antonio, the careful financial planning that kept the operation solvent through the volatile cattle market years. They complemented each other with a precision that sometimes, in the private honesty of late evenings, struck her as the most extraordinary piece of luck she had ever encountered. That the specific things each of them lacked, the other had in abundance, and neither of them had needed to diminish anything in order to supply what the other needed. Daniel Hale visited from New Mexico in the autumn of 1891 with his wife, a warm and funny woman named Rose, who immediately became Josephine's closest friend, and the four of them spent a week together in the Beaumont Creek autumn. Daniel and Levi riding out to look at the cattle in the way brothers do, with comfortable silence and old shorthand, and Josephine and Rose talking on the porch with the kind of wide-ranging, unguarded, joyful conversation that Josephine had not had with another woman since before her father's illness, and had not known she was missing so precisely until it was restored. On the last evening of Daniel and Rose's visit, the four of them sat on the porch with the autumn dark around them, and Henry was asleep inside and Clara was almost asleep in Josephine's arms, and the creek was speaking its endless patient word beyond the yard, and Daniel said, "Levi, you look different." "Different how?" Levi said. "Like a man who knows where he is," Daniel said, and looked at Josephine when he said it, with a warmth and acknowledgment in his glance that she received quietly and kept. Levi was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said, "that's about right." Josephine shifted Clara to a better position on her shoulder, and in the dark she found Levi's hand on the arm of his chair beside her, and she covered it with her own, and he turned it palm up and held hers, and that was enough. In the spring of 1893, a decade after the Tansey-Ragwort crisis, a young woman arrived in Beaumont Creek, the daughter of a rancher newly settled in the eastern part of the county, barely 18 years old, with more cattle knowledge than she knew what to do with and nowhere to put it because the men around her were not interested in hearing it. She came to Josephine's door with a cattle disease question that none of the established ranchers had been able to answer, and Josephine sat her down at the kitchen table and answered it thoroughly, and then spent 2 hours talking with her about her situation, her knowledge, her plans. When the girl left, Levi, who had been in the kitchen doorway for part of the conversation, said, "You were exactly what she needed." "Someone told the truth to her," Josephine said. "That she knows what she knows and she should trust it and not apologize for it." She paused, washing the coffee cups. "Someone should have told me that 20 years ago." "Somebody's daughter will remember that you told her today," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was leaning in the doorway with his arms crossed and his weathered, warm face composed in the serious, warm expression that was still, after 10 years, the most reliable way to dismantle her defenses completely. "Come here," she said, which was not something she said often, and he came without question and stood close, and she put her hands on either side of his face, which she reached easily now that they had 10 years of standing close together, and she looked at him, at the dark eyes, and the lines that weather and time had added to the strong angles of his face, at the gray coming in at his temples, at the entirely unhidden affection that lived in his expression when he looked at her, and she said, "I love you." "I should say it more often." "You say it constantly," he said, "in the ways that matter." "Say it back," she said, not because she doubted it, but because she liked hearing it. "I love you," he said, without hesitation, without caveat, with the whole weight of a decade behind it. "Josephine, I love you." She kissed him, in the kitchen where they had spent 10 years of mornings, with the sound of Henry and Clara beginning to wake in the back of the house, and the cattle in the fields and the creek in its eternal conversation with the land, and the whole long, extraordinary story of how they had arrived in this kitchen on this morning was present in it. The tansy ragwort and the levee and the barn and the ring and the sleepless nights and the hard years and the good years, and the daughter who would remember being told to trust what she knew, all of it present, all of it held, all of it resolved. The house smelled of coffee and cedar, and the outside air that was always coming through the windows, and the children's voices were getting louder, and Levi's arms were around her, and the Texas spring was pressing green and insistent against every window, and the herd, the saved, healthy, thriving, crossbred, carefully managed, living proof of everything she had ever known and worked for and believed, moved in the clean pastures beyond the yard, and everything was exactly, precisely, entirely as it should be. The valley would tell the story for years afterward, the way valleys tell the stories that matter to them over fences and at store counters, and in the specific shorthand of people who know the same land. The story of the Senesiosis outbreak of 1883, and the woman who had known what no one else knew, and the man who had been smart enough to listen. The way the herd had been saved. The way the operation had flourished. The way Josephine Aldridge had walked into a dying pasture with a glass jar and a leather satchel, and a decade of knowledge that the valley had been too careless to notice, and had saved something worth saving, not just the cattle, not just the ranch, but the beginning of a life that neither she nor Levi Hale had entirely known they were capable of, until they built it together. Crawford Finch, in his final years, was known to say to anyone who would listen that the best thing that had ever happened to the ranching community of Beaumont Creek, Texas, was the morning Josephine Aldridge walked through Levi Hale's south pasture gate and proved that the quiet ones always know the most. He said it with the conviction of a man who has learned the lesson too late to have made full use of it, but late understanding is still understanding, and the valley was large enough to hold it. Josephine herself never said much about it. She had never needed to. The pastures spoke for themselves, clean and well-managed and lush, even in the difficult years. The cattle moving through them with the particular health and ease of animals that have been understood as well as tended. Understood by a woman who had always known exactly what she was doing, and had simply, quietly, gone on doing it until the world had the sense to pay attention. And on the evenings when the work was done, and the children were settled, and the creek was speaking in the dark beyond the yard, Levi Hale would find his wife on the porch with a book or a journal or simply with the night air around her, and he would sit beside her with the comfortable ease of a man who is entirely at home, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet, and both were good, and the stars of the Texas sky arched enormous and indifferent overhead. And beneath them, two people who had each been, in their own ways, more than the world had bothered to see, had found in each other the precise and irreplaceable gift of being fully known. Henry grew tall and watchful like his mother, with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and by the time he was 12, he was recording his own observations about the cattle in his own small leather notebook, which Josephine saw once when he left it on the kitchen table, and which she did not mention to him, did not say a word about it, because she remembered the particular importance of being allowed to develop something quietly before anyone else had an opinion about it. Clara grew loud and bright and confident, with a gift for negotiation that would have surprised anyone who did not know her parentage, and surprised no one who did. She argued with cattle buyers at the age of 8 with such focused composure that one of them asked Levi afterward who had taught her that, and Levi said, "Her mother," with a pride so clean and uncomplicated that the buyer had nodded and said nothing else, because there was nothing else necessary. By 1895, a dozen years after the morning Josephine had walked through that pasture gate, the Hale Ranch was known as far as Fort Worth and San Antonio as an operation of both scale and quality, and Josephine Hale's name was in 2 agricultural college publications and had been cited in correspondence between the Texas Livestock Bureau and the Federal Agricultural Department in Washington. She kept those letters in the same flat tin box where she had kept her father's deed documents, which she thought would have made Henry Aldridge smile. The story had an ending that was also a beginning, the way the best stories always do. The land went on. The creek went on. The cattle went on, healthy in their clean pastures, the descendants of the animals that had been saved on a June morning in 1883 by a woman with a glass jar and the knowledge nobody had thought to ask her for. The children went on, growing into themselves in the way children do when they are given the specific, irreplaceable gift of parents who were themselves genuinely alive, genuinely present and purposeful and real. And Josephine Aldridge, who had become Josephine Hale in the Methodist Church on a February morning, with turquoise on her finger, and the whole unexpected rest of her life opening in front of her, went on observant and precise and direct, and capable and loved, completely and without reservation or caveat loved, by the man beside her on the porch in the Texas dark, who had been smart enough to ask the right question on the right morning and lucky enough to receive the right answer. And who would tell you, if you asked, that the best thing he had ever done in his life, better than any business decision, better than any negotiation, better than any of the hard-won accomplishments he had worked and bled for in the building of something worth building, was crossing the street at the Beaumont Creek General Store and lifting a heavy salt block into a woman's wagon without making a speech about it, because sometimes the whole architecture of a life hinges on a single small, honest, unremarkable act of decency, and the person you do it for turns out to be carrying everything you were looking for in a worn leather satchel 2 miles north. The valley settled into evening. The creek spoke. The stars came out over the Texas plain in their ancient, abundant, indifferent majesty, and below them the ranch lights came on one by one in the windows of the house where Josephine and Levi Hale had made their life, and the light was warm and steady and visible from a long way off, the way good things always are, to anyone who bothers to look.